our hearts. You see, I realize that today we do a lot of things because that's just the way we've always done them, right? I think about the young lady, you've heard about her, right? She always cut off the end of the ham. She had no clue why she cut off the end of the ham, but finally one day she was questioned, and so she said, I cut off the end of the ham because my mama always cut off the end of the ham. Well, let's go ask your mama why she always cut off the end of the ham. Well, her mama said, because my mama always cut off the end of the ham. Well, let's go get Grandma and ask Grandma why she cut off the end of the ham. And Grandma said, because I didn't have a pan big enough for the ham to go in. I don't know why I've done it. I just always done it that way. You know, there's a lot of activity, but there's not a lot of thought, not a lot of heart in it. It's just the way we've always done it, right? Or I think about a story I read not too long ago that the tracks on the railroad, and no, I have not went out there and measured them, and if you want to, help yourself, are 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. Consistently. 4 feet 8.5 inches. Why 4 feet 8.5 inches? Why not 4 feet? Why not 4 feet 8 inches? Well, the reality of it is that the guys who built the railroad tracks came over from England. Guess how far the tracks are apart in England? They're 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. Why are the tracks 4 feet 8.5 inches apart in England? Well, because that's where the wheels are on the rail cars. Why are the wheels on the rail cars 4 feet 8.5 inches apart? Well, that's because that's how far the wagon wheels are apart in England. Well, why are the wagon wheels 4 feet 8.5 inches apart? Well, that's because that's how far apart the ruts are in the road where the wagons travel. Well, why are the ruts 4 feet 8.5 inches apart? Well, it's because it takes 4 feet 8.5 inches to cover the backside of 2 horses. There you go. So we build rail cars that have wheels that are 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. And there's, according to this story, there's tracks all over the United States of America, and there's one close by if you want to go check it. 4 feet 8.5 inches. It's just because that's the way we've always done it, right? We structured it to be built this way, and we've done it this way, and we've passed it down this way. Not a lot of thought, not a lot of purpose. Would it travel faster if it's only 4 feet apart? Would it be more stable if it was 5 feet apart? Who knows? Who cares, right? It's 4 feet 8.5 inches. And while all of that, cutting off the end of the ham and building railroad tracks, might be very insignificant to eternity, what it illustrates for us is what's happening in the hearts and lives of a lot of Christians. We're just doing things because we've always done them that way. And I'm going to be right up front, and I'm going to be right frank with you. The answer to a question of why we do something because we've always done it that way is not a scriptural answer. Now, you make that clear. Now, we may have done things because Scripture says that's the way we ought to do it. But just telling somebody, well, that's the way we've always done it, is not a biblical answer. But we've bought into that, and we've gotten into that rut that is 4 feet 8.5 inches apart, and we don't intend to go anywhere else because that's where it just kind of leads us, and it doesn't take a lot of effort, and it doesn't take a lot of heart, and it doesn't take a lot of thought. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that road might lead to a place you don't want to go. In the days of Zechariah, in the passage that Johnny read a moment ago, when he got through those fun names, he got down to verse 3. And the question's asked, should we continue to fast on the 5th month? Now, why is that significant? Well, it's significant because God had required one fast of the Old Testament people. It was called the Day of Atonement. You know when that day occurred? Well, it occurred in the 7th month. Now, I'm not here to discuss whether the 5th was May or July or September, but I can see very clearly that the 5th and the 7th are 2 different months, can't you? What had the Israelites done? Well, the Israelites, while they were in captivity for 7 years, had said, we'll keep the fast on the 7th month, but then we're going to have a fast on the 5th month, as though to say, well, 2 fasts ought to be better than 1. Right? And while that might be the case, here's what the problem is. When you get into verse 4 of Zechariah chapter 7 and you see what the Lord has to say, the Lord of hosts speaks in verse 4, and here's what He says in verse 5. Say to all the people of the land and the priests, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th month and in the 7th for these 70 years, here's the question. God says, let me ask you something. Are you worshiping the Creator, or are you worshiping the worship? Now that's an eternal, significant answer. Are you worshiping the God of heaven, or are you worshiping the worship? Because it appeared to me, look at what he says. Who was it for in the first place? Was it for me that you fasted? It goes on in verse 6 and says, when you eat and when you drink, who'd you do it for? You did it for yourselves. God says, I don't know how to be any plainer. Instead of worshiping the God of creation, you are worshiping the worship. Now, how does that look today? Well, it's very simple. You call it meddling, I call it preaching. It's very simple. What if I've been here 8 years now. I don't know of a Sunday where we hadn't partaken of the Lord's Supper at the beginning of service. How about you? I don't know how long that's been done. But let's say we moved it to the end. Well, there'd be some people in this building that would go AWOL. Is that scriptural? Well, it's just as scriptural at the beginning as it is at the end, ain't it? Or let's say, as he commonly does, and I'll pick on him because I love him, let's say Roger Hamilton leads 2 songs before the first prayer. Boy, that throws the prayer off and throws the rest of us off. Or let's say that the 3rd verse of a song is sung. Ooh. Boy, that cuts into dinner time, doesn't it? Or let's say that the preacher gets a little carried away and he goes a little over. I'm just asking you, where's your heart? You say, I had never heard anybody thank me for going short. Are we worshiping the God of heaven, or are we worshiping worship? And I'm fully convinced there are some scriptural things, and we need to be doing Bible things Bible way, and we need to be scriptural. That's not at all what I'm after here. But you cannot find me an order of service in the Bible. And if you want to do 3 songs in a prayer, or 4 songs in a prayer, or 2 songs in a prayer, or if you want to sing all 4 verses of the song, or all 5 verses. No, there was a time when we sang all 13 verses of Just As I Am, right? So be it. You want to get out it? Well, I'm going to hold the name. But I was told that we needed to quit praying for the hour of worship here, because thanks to our preacher, we go a lot longer than an hour. So we're supposed to get out at, we start at 10:15, we're supposed to get out at 11:15. I could go on and on all day with illustration after illustration, just trying to get you to analyze, where is your heart? You see, have I so structured myself into worship that if it doesn't fit the structure, then I'm blowed out of the water? My whole day's messed up because worship didn't fit my structure versus me fitting into God's structure. Where is my heart? Who am I here to worship? Who is this about? Is it about me or is it about God? You see, in the days of Zechariah, God says, I don't care how often you fast. You can fast every month if you want to. But the reality of it is you're fasting for the wrong reason. Or as Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 6, when you fast and you make your face gloomy and you look like the hypocrites, what good have you done? When you fast in secret, and your Father who is in secret will reward you openly. See, in the days of Zechariah, they were much like the days of Jesus in Matthew 15. These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. He's quoting from Isaiah 29. But he's making reference to the Pharisees of the day in which he lived from the prophecy that Isaiah had spoken hundreds of years before. The times hadn't changed much. They were kind of the same in the days of Zechariah. They were there in form, they were there in presence, they were there in body, they were there in activity, but what they really needed was a spiritual revival. Because there wasn't a lot of heart and there wasn't a lot of thought going into what they were doing. Let's don't be guilty of that. Why? Well, Zechariah chapter 7 makes it very clear. Here's what the Lord wants. The Lord wants us to render true judgments and to show kindness and mercy to one another. Not to oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, the poor, to let none of you devise evil against another in your hearts. Verses 9 and 10. What does God desire? God desires heartfelt worship. God desires heartfelt service. God desires that we serve, that we help, that we look out, that we care from the heart. I heard a preacher say a long time ago, I love the joke, by the way. I love the humorous phrase, well, the preacher just really stepped on our toes today. I do enjoy that, you know. But I got to be honest with you, I heard a preacher say a few years ago, well, if all I got was your toes, I missed. Because I was aiming at your heart. See, that's what God wants. He wants your heart. And sometimes we need to be cut to the heart in order to make some very devastating, very crucial changes to our lives. It needs to go deep. It needs to go all the way down into who we are and what we are, what makes us up. Because God desires that we do these things from a pure heart. I'll just use myself for an illustration here. I try not to do that very often, but have you ever asked somebody, how are you? You go up to somebody and you say, hey, how are you? I really don't want them to answer. You ever done that? And oh me, if they do answer, my whole day's shot. It's like, hey, how are you? Well, I'm just not really good. Let me tell you about what all's going on. No. That ain't what I asked for. Well, then, why'd you open your mouth, right? Do you really care or do you not? I'm admitting to you that there are times in my life when my heart hadn't been where it ought to be. Maybe I've asked that question. You know what I'm really saying? Please don't tell me. Or maybe it is that, you know, I just don't like the songs that are being picked out. I don't mind to go to church. I enjoy singing, but, well, that's some pretty crummy songs. Don't fuss at the song leader on Sunday mornings, because that'd be my fault. I just think I'll get mad because I don't like that. What really matters? What are you really focused on? What am I really focused on? Do I really care? Is it really important? Am I willing to swallow my pride and what I think in order for someone else to be heard and their opinion to matter? That's a tall order. Can I do it? Well, it matters greatly where my heart is and what is deep down inside of me at the core. Because if that's right, then my actions and my words and my attitudes and my feelings can be right. If that's not right, God says, here's what I desire from you, but notice what they did. You're still in Zechariah chapter 7, down in verse 11. They refused to pay attention, and they turned a stubborn shoulder, and they stopped their ears that they might not hear. That's pretty bold, isn't it? God says, here's what I desire from you. I desire heartfelt worship. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to render righteous judgment. I want you to help those that are less fortunate. I want you to be kind and compassionate. I want you to care about others. I want you to be there for others. They said, we ain't got time for that. We don't want to hear that. They turned a cold shoulder and a deaf ear. Their hearts, look at verse 12, their hearts become diamond hard, English Standard Version says, lest they should hear the law and the words of the Lord of the host that He had sent by His Spirit through the former prophets. They turned a cold shoulder. They closed their ears off. They allowed their hearts to become cold and hard. And they shut out the Lord. They shut out His desires. They shut out what He wanted. And you and I are capable of the same. You and I are capable of turning a shoulder to the Lord, turning our back on the Lord, shutting our ears down so that we no longer can hear because we don't want to hear what the Lord has to say. We call that, in human terms, selective hearing, right? We husbands are good at it. We turn those deaf ears because we don't want to hear. And what happens when our backs are turned and our ears are shut off is that our heart is drawn further and further away, and we grow colder and colder and colder. And all the actions may be there. These people are building the temple of the Lord. At the same time, the Lord is saying their hearts are diamond hard. They're in day in and day out activity of being together, assembling the house for the Lord's presence that God had required or commanded. And yet He describes them. You see, what you see on the outside is one thing. Here's what's going on the inside. They are refusing. What a sad commentary on a group of people. What a sad commentary on a group of Christians, if that be the case. God desires heartfelt worship. Well, what if we decide, hey, I don't want to put my heart into it? Well, God makes that very clear. You want to be heartless? All right, here's what it looks like. As I called, they would not hear. God says, I tried to reach out to you, you wouldn't hear me. So guess what? When they called to me, God says, It's a two-way road. If they can put a dead end up, God says, I can put a dead end up too. Can you imagine God saying, I don't want to hear you anymore? In Bible class this morning over in the annex, the wise man Solomon mentioned God being angry even at hearing our voice. Could you imagine? God saying, you don't want to hear me? Then I don't want to hear you. And that's the way this thing works. You refuse to offer heartfelt worship to me. God says, I refuse to hear your prayer. Not only that, but He says in verse 14, I scattered them with a whirlwind among all the nations that they had not known. Thus the land they left was desolate, so that no one went to and fro. And the pleasant land, God said, I made desolate. Why? Well, it's simple. They didn't want to offer me heartfelt worship. God says, I punish them. God says, you refuse, I'll refuse. I'll refuse to bless you. I'll refuse to give you the land that flows with milk and honey. I'll refuse the promises that I have given to those who would be obedient, because you're not being obedient. The people in the days of Zechariah needed a heart revival. It needed a spiritual revival. I'm amazed that as I look through the New Testament. Do you realize how much the heart is involved? For where your treasure is, Matthew 6:21, there your heart will be also. For where your treasure is, there's where your heart, you find it. In Acts 2 and verse 37, they were cut, pricked to the very core of their being. What brought those on the day of Pentecost to say, what must we do to be saved? The deepest conviction, the deepest acknowledgement of wrong, the deepest confession of disobedience. They were cut all the way to the heart. You see, what Peter and the other apostles had told them, it didn't just prick their skin where they bled a little bit. It didn't just decapitate their leg where they only had a half a leg left. It went all the way in to the innermost part of who they were. They were cut to the heart. And then they ask, what must we do to be saved? Romans chapter 10. We use our mouths to confess that Jesus is Lord. But notice what we use our heart. We use our heart to believe in order that we might be justified. We use our heart. Belief is in the heart. Faith is in the heart. Trust is in the heart. It goes all the way to the heart of the matter, of who you are. Many other passages. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 22. Flee the evil desire of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 22. A pure heart. Or how about Hebrews 10 and verse 22? Let us draw near with a true heart. Draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith. Or maybe one more in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22. Love each other deeply with all your heart. You love one another deeply with all your heart. You see, form is one thing. Essence is another. And essence is who we are. You see, it's one thing to have form and essence. It's another thing just to have form. God says through the prophet Zechariah, I'm not pleased with my people. The question is, should we continue to fast on the 5th month? The reality is, God says, I don't want you to do anything until you evaluate your heart and you analyze who it's for in the first place. Because at this point, all I see is your back and your closed ears and your hard heart. That describes our lives. And we look at the question, where is your heart? May God cut us to the most inner being of our core. And may we, like those on the day of Pentecost, request of God, what must I do to be saved? Who is it for? God desires heartfelt worship. Are you giving Him that? God desires a life that serves from a pure heart. Are you giving Him that? I am mine no more. Are you? Can you sing that? If your heart's centered on you, please don't sing. I am mine no more. What do you say? God, I belong to you. God, my heart belongs to you. God, my life belongs to you. I want to serve and worship the Creator. I really hope that's the case for all of us. But if it's not this morning, can we help you as we stand and sing?